I think, Angela, you may start sharing. We'll start in 2, 3 minutes. Maybe let's give it another couple of minutes before we can start. Okay, so hello everyone, and welcome to the seminar series of the World Bank Research Center in Kuala Lumpur. We are starting our first cycle of 2022 with this presentation today, where we have Angela Montfaucon and Socrates Majune, who will jointly present their paper on the impact of lockdown policies on trade in Philippines. Angela is an economist at the macroeconomics trade and investment global practice at the World Bank, and Socrates is a tutorial fellow at the University of Nairobi, where he is pursuing his PhD as well. Socrates is also a young professional at the World Trade Organization. The talk is around 40 to 45 minutes long, and the remaining of the hour would be a Q&A session. If you have any clarifying questions that need to be asked during the presentation, please send them to me privately, and I can ask them at a suitable time. So, Angela and Socrates, please start at your convenience.
Thank you very much, Shafat, and thank you so much for having us today to present our paper. So our other co-author, Guillermo, is not here, but we also recognize that the three of us worked on this paper, and this was one of the background papers for a broader report looking at global value chains and the configuration of global value chain participation in the Philippines following the COVID-19 pandemic. So I will present just the first two parts of the presentation, an introduction, and also as a way of motivation of why we think that this is an important and interesting piece of research. And I'll talk a little bit about the data, then I'll pass it on to Socrates, who will take us through our empirical strategy and the results, and then finally conclude the presentation. So as a way of introduction, but also some sort of motivation, first of all, we know that the most governments impose lockdown measures at the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic in early 2020 to try and mitigate the spread and the impact of the virus. And there was a range of measures, as we know, closure of schools, workplaces, etc. And Hill et al. And then the Oxford Project have really detailed all of these policies for each government at a daily level by the different types of policies, which we use extensively in our analysis. So these measures, when we just look specifically at trade, they had quite an impact on the economy more broadly. But when we look at the value and the volume of merchandise trade in the world, there was significant decline in 2020. But the empirical evidence on the effect of these pandemics on international trade is still coming up, because we're very much still in the pandemic. And most of the evidence that exists at the moment, they cover developed countries, or they are primarily descriptive. So we are trying to fill this gap to look at the deep dive at the country level impact of these lockdown policies on international trade for that country. So why do we look at the Philippines? So apart from this broader analysis on the configuration of global value chains due to COVID-19 for the Philippines is also among the top traders in East Asia, and was also among the most affected countries by the virus, especially at the beginning of the pandemic. About 31% of all COVID cases at the end of 2020, which is actually where our data ends, in East Asia, were actually in the Philippines, and it was second only to Indonesia. So it was really affected by the pandemic, but also quite a key country when it comes to international trade. And when the pandemic hit, it spiraled and increased quite notably in the country, especially between mid-August to mid-October, when the Philippines even topped the East Asia countries in terms of the number of cases and deaths, second only to Indonesia. So both of these factors make this what we thought would be interesting and important to look at how trade was then affected by these measures. And just looking at the numbers, purely the change, we see that exports and imports of goods and services decreased by nearly 50 percentage points and 65% by April 2020 alone. When we look at year-on-year changes, and the drop in goods and services exports was quite unprecedented. So it was larger than the Asian financial crisis, and it was larger than the global financial crisis, the impact of COVID, that is, at least with the COVID crisis. So all of these factors really motivate our paper to look into a little bit more detail on how trade was affected. So that ultimately is our key research question, is how the lockdown policies that were in place to tackle COVID-19 affected trade in the Philippines. Of course, these lockdown policies are not necessarily over, but we have done this analysis up to December 2020. And what this chart is showing is the stringency index of the various lockdown policies. So this index is just putting together all of the policies into one. And it's showing the policies for the Philippines as well as neighboring countries. And here we can see when the Philippines started, which is 31st January 2020, which is when the first of these policies were put in place. So the red line that we're seeing, this is following the stringency index of the Philippines when it comes to various lockdown measures, and how it really varied over time depending on the spread and how the pandemic was progressing. And we see similar variations across neighboring countries of the Philippines. And what this tells us is perhaps we can expect that the lockdown measures of the Philippines and maybe and especially trading partners may affect both imports and exports. And these variations give us the variations that would help us to analyze those changes. So how do we do that? So our approach mainly focuses on the lockdown policies of the partner countries. So we focus on the external lockdown measures, but we do also cover Philippines' domestic measures also as a robustness, because we do want to either siphon that out and see that whether it was the country's own lockdowns or the partners' lockdowns that really affected trade. So our lockdown dummy is based on whether the Philippines and or the partner country impose one of the following restrictions. So workplace closure, closure of public transport, stay-at-home requirements, restrictions on internal movement and international travel controls. And we look at both aggregate trade, but also try to decipher whether those changes are from the extensive or intensive margins. We also look at survival, though we do not present that in this particular presentation today, just to try to keep it within the time, but you can find this in the paper. And we in terms of the positioning, we try to uncover this within the understanding of global value chains and looking at intermediate goods to understand the global value chains angle a little bit better and see what policy messages could come out of this, especially since the Philippines, as mentioned before, was one of the hardest hit in terms of trade. So just to give a summary of the findings in case we don't make it to the very end or some people have to leave. So our key findings are as follows. First, when we look at the domestic policies, the lockdown policies by the Philippines as a country itself, we do not find that they had any significant effect on international trade, but we do find that it was the lockdown policies of trading partners that affected both imports and exports. These lockdowns led to a drop in by 7 percentage points of average monthly export values and over 56 percentage points in terms of import values. So the effect on imports was much larger. And we find that the key driver for the drop in exports was the number of products rather than, it was more in the extensive margin than intensive margin. And when we look specifically at intermediate goods and to say something a little bit more about global value chain trade, we find that these were the key driver for the drop in exports, especially following the foreign lockdowns. But we also find that exports of intermediate goods were a lot more resilient to the lockdown. So some suggestions that GVC trade was a little bit more resilient. And there was also a little bit more resilient with trade with top partners. So a little bit on the data, we use the Philippine Statistic Authority data. So this is product destination month level data. And so we have imports and exports of every month from January 2019 to December 2020, disaggregated at the HS10 level and by country. And this data is in US dollars. We have about 243 destinations for exports and about 211 source countries for our imports. as mentioned a little bit earlier, the COVID-19 lockdown measures is from the Hill et al. Data sets. And this details, we have a stringency that puts together all of the policies, but we also try to dissect those lockdown measures to see if some specific lockdown measures had more impact than others. So just looking at the trends and composition of trade, so a little bit of a descriptive analysis of the data, looking at the cumulative export and import values in the 2019-2020 period for which our study is focused. So on the left is a chart for exports, and we are showing the cumulative exports on the y-axis and month by month on the x-axis, and the dotted line is for 2020, while the straight line is for 2019. And then we're showing the lockdowns and severe lockdown and relaxation, and then looking at how these trade values changed in those same months for the 2 years. So the mild lockdown basically is looking at when we only have a few restrictions in the Philippines, and the severe lockdown is when we have all of the measures that we mentioned are in place, while relaxation is the first month when some lockdown measures were lifted. So we can see that in a sense, we get the picture that once the lockdowns were in place, with the mild lockdowns, we don't see an immediate effect just yet. But when we have the severe lockdowns, we can see that drop in both exports and imports. As alluded to earlier, the impact on imports is definitely larger, at least from just the numbers and the descriptives, compared to exports. But at the same time, we see that even when there's a relaxation in these measures, we don't see that trade has immediately recovers. When we look at more trends and composition of trade and looking at the products and their share before and during the lockdowns, so this is for us to see if there was a change in the structure of trade after COVID-19 hit and continued. So in the export shares, import shares, and the difference, the numbers in red are the products that dropped, that the imports that dropped, for example, and this is the exports that increased. So sorry, this should be blue, not red. And the blue are the products that increased in terms of their share. So in summary, what we see here is that for the rest of the paper, these products that you see, apart from other products, are what we consider as intermediate goods in addition to the BEC classification. So we try to look at them specifically, so we don't just have a category that says intermediate. We actually try to put them into what are these intermediate goods. So because we know that the Philippines, these are the key components that that are used, especially in the exports. So one of the key things to note is that components and devices are the ones that increased, while machinery and transport equipment also increased, decreased in terms of imports. In terms of exports, again, components and devices increased. Broadly, all of the other products did not change that much during the lockdown. In terms of the structure of trade and the trading partners, the key thing to note here is that the share of total trade, both imports and exports, with neighboring countries to the Philippines actually increased after lockdowns. So what this is suggesting to us is that near neighboring countries or maybe more regional value chains proved to be more important in sort of sustaining trade during the lockdown. In terms of the broad structure, there was not a huge change, but it's important to note that trade increased with these neighboring countries, with the Philippines. And then when we think about the intensive and extensive margins, what we do is the intensive margin, we look at the average sales per product by month and trading partner. And for the extensive margin, we look at the total of products traded, imported, and exported with a specific trading partner in a particular month. And we analyze both of these later on in the empirical aspects. So this is my last table, then I will pass it on to Socrates. And we are just looking again at the intensive and extensive margins in 2019 and 2020, and then seeing at the changes in the growth rates of those margins, the partners. So this is partners, the products, and this is the intensive margin changes. So this table a little bit crowded here, but our attempt to put all of the survival analysis sort of aspects that would be way too many to show in charts. But in a nutshell, we see that broadly the variations in import and export values between 2019 and December 2020 seem to be coming from the intensive margin. But what we then try to test is to see if the changes in trade due to COVID were also driven by the intensive margin. So let me pass it over to Socrates, who will take us through the empirical strategy and the results. Socrates, over to you.
Thank you very much, Angela, and good morning, everyone who is joining us. So the empirical strategy, adding on to what Angela has already presented, is to just assist us understand by what magnitude was were both exports and imports affected by the lockdowns. So what we'll be doing in these next sessions will now be showing the empirically the respective coefficients, whether they're significant or not, and looking at it from an aspect of both aggregate trade, and then we look at the respective intermediate commodities, and we also like to look at how this trade is affected by respective trading partners, and then we have a couple of robustness checks. So for the start, let me just explain what empirical strategy we use here. So we use an event study approach, of which looks like this first equation. So in this equation, we have three forms of fixed effects, where we have the month time fixed effect here, and then you also have the product month fixed effects. And then the other fixed effect that we have is a product partner fixed effects. Of course, all these three fixed effects are just to address any chances of endogeneity arising from the periods or even the characteristics of the respective products that are there. But the key thing to pay attention to these other terms that are remaining here. This is why we use an event study. So, sorry, this whatever we are seeing here moving from -2 to J -12 needs to have a summation sign. So I think it will be best for me to state that it's just a typing error here. So what we do in an event study is you have to understand the periods before and also the periods after an event occurs. So in this case, we are interested in what is the period before countries imposed lockdowns versus after. So for those periods which are before the lockdown was imposed is called leads. And these leads are the ones we are seeing that they are moving from J -12 to -2, and explain this the reason for this period. And then for the period after the lockdown is imposed, or rather during the lockdown, is now moving from J0 to J11. And these are usually called lags. So that's why when you look at the original paper, the final paper, you'll find that, especially for tables, you find some class, they have shown results in terms of leads and the lags. So the reason these periods are moving from -12 to -2 is we have to identify the correct period. In this case, the maximum amount of months that we consider for this whole study is 24 months, because our data is moving from January of 2019 to December of 2020. But then we then look at it and say, okay, when did the first trading partners of the Philippines impose lockdown policies, any of those conditions that Angela had already indicated. And we find that the earliest a partner imposed a lockdown policy was in January of 2020, which means the periods before the lockdown was imposed is already beyond the 12 months. So for purposes of now, helping us to interpret the results, we need to have a reference category, which is a month before the lockdown was imposed. That's why we have J-1. And then we now start looking at the effects of the lockdown from J0. Since this equation is meant for the external lockdown, to show the effects of the external lockdown, we are also cognizant that some of these effects might be arising domestically. That's why we have this term that is colored in red to represent the domestic lockdown, where we know I here is a product, and then the P is a Philippines, which is a country, and then T is a time in terms of months. And then, of course, the last term is the error term. Angela, next. Okay, so we briefly just show some descriptive statistics here. So we describe both exports and imports trade. So in terms of export value, we can see that the mean export value was about $553,000, while the import value is about $232,000. So, and then the other thing we are seeing is a lockdown dummy, which is whether any of those conditions occurred in the country, the ones Angela had explained before. So here we show them for both exports and imports, and we find that about 43% on average of destination countries or partner countries of Philippines had imposed these lockdowns. And then there is this stringency index that we also introduce. This index pure is different from the lockdown dummy, whereby it purely just tells us what is the share of countries which imposed severe lockdown policies, or rather, this is now calculated by looking at countries whose stringency index is above the median level, and we find from export perspective we have 53% of them, and then for the import perspective we have 50% of these countries imposed stringent lockdown policies. Next, Angela. Okay, now on to the respective results. So the key thing here, I'll be spending a lot of time to explain, especially these blue spikes, because these are the coefficients that show us that whether the effect is statistically significant or not. And here we consider this significance either at 1%, 5%, or at 10%. So the first time we look at this effect on the export value and also the export quantity. So from the from the top graph, we see that immediately lockdown policies were imposed in destination countries, or rather partner countries. We find that exports reacted by declining by about close to 10%, and then about 8% in the next month. The third month, the same thing, are about 10%. And then we see a slight recovery starting from the fourth month onwards, but this is only significant up to the fifth month. The story is slightly different when you look at the quantity. Quantities started to decline immediately. Lockdown policies were imposed, and this characteristic continued up to about the fourth month until the fifth month, when we start seeing a response, or rather a positive reaction towards the lockdown policies that were imposed by trading partners. Next, Angela. We then do the same thing and look at the effects of lockdown policies from partner countries on imports. So from the case of imports, it's quite clear there was no recovery. Actually, what we are seeing is that both the import values and export values import values and quantities started to decline immediately. Lockdown policies were imposed by the trading partners, and we find that the magnitude continues to drop until the end of the period that our study covers. And the other thing you need to realize here is that the magnitude of the effect on the quantity is higher than that of the value. Possibly now what gives us an idea is maybe there was some effect of the exchange rate on how these quantities performed when lockdown policies were imposed. Angela, next. Okay, so here we now go a bit specific. Then we ask ourselves, how did the export and import values of intermediate products react to the external lockdown policies? So from the upper graph, you see that there's no indication of any blue, meaning that there is no coefficient that was actually statistically significant. So we can say that the effect that we see on products is actually arising from products which are not intermediate goods. But the intermediate goods, we don't see that a major significant effect that came from this external lockdown. But then when you look at the import side from this lower graph, what we see is that a clear indication that the reason why imports dropped is because the reaction of the import of the intermediate commodities, where we see that they dropped immediately. The lockdown policies were imposed from the first month, and this decline was persistent until up around the 5th month, when we start seeing the positive, or rather recovery from the lockdown policies. Next, Angela. So besides just stopping at indicating how all these intermediate products were affected, we also look at the respective commodities, and here we concentrate on just a few products which were those products whose effects were statistically significant. We see that when you look at exports, especially consumer electronics declined significantly between the 3rd and the 6th month. And also we have the machinery and transport equipment, which improved from the 3rd month. Also, the exports of products which are not intermediate commodities declined significantly, especially between the 1st and the 8th month. This is just to again reiterate that these non-intermediate commodities were the key reason why the exports dropped in the Philippines. And then when we look at the import side, we find that there was a significant drop, especially from the consumer electronics and also machinery and transport equipment, and also still the products which are not classified as intermediate, or rather the other products, for the entire period of the lockdown. Next, Angela. Okay, we also look at the trading partners, and here we look at these trading partners which Angela had already shown, the top 10. So we'd like to know how exactly did the imposition of the lockdown in those countries affect both the export value and the import value. So from this upper graph, what we are seeing is that the export value is only dropped significantly in the first month of the imposition of the lockdown, but for the rest of the period, we are not seeing a significant effect. So that also gives us a hint that the drop in the exports from the Philippines was mainly from non-top 10 or rather other smaller trading partners. Those are the key reason why the exports declined. But then when you look at the imports, there's a clear evidence here that the decline mainly rose from these top 10 countries. And this started from the first month and the trend persisted up to the end, and there is no sign of recovery. So in the next slide that we'll be showing how the respective countries, how respective countries reacted, affected this trade. So we can see here that when you look at the exports, we realize that specifically exports to China and Hong Kong significantly increased for most of the periods that the lockdown was active. But then it's proved that the major decline rose from this rest of the world, where we find that for the entire period that the lockdown was active in those countries, exports actually declined. From the import perspective, we find that the key reason why there was this collapse was mainly because of the drop in trade imports from China, Japan, the USA, and also the rest of the world. Next, Angela. Okay, we also look at the trade margins. How exactly did both the extensive and also the intensive margin react to the external lockdowns? And you remember this part of the niche of our paper where we are introducing an aspect of trade margins. Once again, the extensive margin represents the total number of products that were traded with the partners, while the intensive margin represents the average sales per product. And we see that the extensive margin from this top graph mainly started to drop significantly 6 months after lockdowns were imposed, and that drop has been persistent and there's no indication of recovery. So possibly what this tells us is with a lot of these restrictions, a lot of the new farms or rather new products were the ones which are exiting the markets, as opposed to now the intensive margin, where we see that there was a slight drop in the first month, but the rest of the months was fluctuating, but are still positive and higher than this pre-lockdown period. So it means that the trade purely, especially exports, were being supported by the existing trading relationships. Those are the existing farms that are there, the existing products that are there, and then existing trading partners that are there, as opposed to new relationships. Next, Angela. We then look at it from the perspective of imports. Once again, it might not be quite clear here, but imports also start to decline significantly in terms of the extensive margin from the sixth month, and this trend stays the same, as opposed to the intensive margin, where we see clearly that there is a persistent growth, especially from the sixth month, where we see that sorry, there's an increase. So purely what these two results for both imports and exports tell us is that a lot of these restrictions possibly hindered the meeting of business people and those interactions, and the creation of new trade relationships became a bit hard. Next, Angela. Okay, so the thing that we also do is we now go a bit detailed and look at how respective products reacted for both exports and import intensive margin. So the decline, especially in the export extensive margin, was due to the collapse of the exports of these components and other products, while the intensive margin, which we saw increased, was mainly boosted by other commodities, or rather the non-intermediate commodities. When we look at it from the imports perspective, we see that the collapse was mainly because of the drop in the extensive margin of the components, also ignition and wiring, and also non-intermediate commodities. But on the import intensive margin perspective, which we've seen increased, was mainly boosted by all these intermediate commodities, except electronic and data processing, which whose coefficients were not statistically significant, and also the non-intermediate goods. Next, Angela. We then ask ourselves a lot of questions. What kind of robustness checks can we put to just be sure that our results are reliable? So we conducted 3 different robustness checks in this case. So the first robustness check was to ask ourselves, we've mainly concentrated on looking at the effect of external lockdown policies, or rather what trading partners imposed. But then what was the reaction for Philippines itself? How did exports and imports react to the domestic lockdown policies? So we use the same event study analysis. And then, of course, here we also have to just control for the effect of external lockdowns. We also have an indicator there, a term indicating external lockdowns to control for external effect. So what we see is that we do not find evidence of the effect of both exports and imports having been affected by domestic lockdowns, although the effect on imports is a bit sensitive in terms of the kinds of fixed effects that are used, whereby we found that if we only consider the month time fixed effect, then we find that the drop in imports is actually significant. The other robustness check that we do is to purely now see how do the different lockdown measures affect the performance of exports and imports. Once again, here we analyze our original model, which looks at the external lockdowns. So what did the workplace closure in our trading partner, how did that affect international trade? And what we find is that the closure of workplaces, restrictions on international movement and international travel controls actually had a negative effect on exports. And then all these lockdown policies, the workplace closure, the stay-at-home requirement, the restrictions in international movement and international travel controls reduced import values, especially the closure of workplaces, the stay-at-home requirements, then also restrictions, and then lastly, the international travel controls. Next, Angela. Okay, since we also realized that products were reacting differently to external lockdowns, and this was a bit surprising because the same product, when it's an export, reacts differently from the imports. So that gave us a hint that possibly there's a product level differences that are occurring, how they reacted here, and it's what we tested here. So we use a case of 2 countries, China and the US. At least China is more of a neighboring country, while the US is, yes, a top 10 trading partner with the Philippines, but a bit far from the Philippines. So we do this exercise for components, electronic data processing, and also machinery and transport equipment. And what we find is that there's evidence of product level differences, which means exports and imports of the same products reacted differently in China, but in the US, the reaction was actually the same. On to the conclusion, Angela. So as we come to the conclusion, what are some of the things that we will will remember as a policymaker from this presentation of ours. First is that there's evidence that both exports and imports dropped upon the imposition of lockdowns by trading partners. But we do not find any evidence that domestic lockdown affected both exports and imports of the Philippines. Of course, there's a caveat there that what we find that imports are a bit sensitive to the kinds of fixed effects that we use when we consider domestic lockdowns. And the lockdowns in the Philippines, the smaller trading partners were the key the drivers of the decline in exports, while the larger trading partners were responsible for the fall in imports. And here by larger, we mean those top 10 countries. The drop in exports is attributed to the drop in non-intermediate products, while intermediate goods, specifically consumer electronics, machinery and transport, and intermediate products were responsible for the decline in imports. Next, Angela. Therefore, some of the insights we get from this is that the export GVC trade was robust to the lockdown, because we see that intermediate commodities were actually not affected by these lockdown policies in terms of exports. But when we look at the import perspective, which gives a hint of the backward GVC, they actually declined during the pandemic. The other thing is that both exports and imports were more affected at the extensive margin than at the intensive margin when the lockdown was imposed. Of course, now giving a hint that possibly forming new trading relationships, launching new products in markets was largely hampered by these COVID-19 lockdown policies. In general, GVCs through the extensive supply chains, networks with diversified and geographically dispersed suppliers can help countries adjust better and contribute to a speedy recovery and possible resilience to future shocks. That brings us to the end of the presentation, and thank you very much. Look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Angela and Socrates, for a very well presented paper, as well as very well timed. We are exactly on time for the Q&A session. So I would request anyone who has question to unmute and just ask, but I can start the session by asking my question. So if you look at the effects, my first question is about, you find that overall, so we would think usually that external lockdown policies are demand shock for your exports. But what's really interesting in your results is that we find that while the value decreases, quantity decreases even more. And because you're running these specifications in logs, it seems to suggest that prices rise as a result of these lockdowns, which makes me think whether it is a supply shock for these countries because of the global value chains, which is more dominant rather than a demand shock, which could be a very nice point that your results could make. I mean, one way to strengthen this and to check this is if you can look at whether workplace closures have different impact rather than the retail mobility or some other stay-at-home orders, which stay-at-home orders could be more of a demand shock, whereas work closures can, in some sense, give some idea of the supply shock if those goods are inputs to Philippines exports. Also, it would be interesting if you can look at whether countries, lockdowns in countries which have more of value added in Philippines exports, if those are a supply shock rather than a demand shock, whereas the countries which are destination for Philippines value added, their lockdowns would be more of a demand shock. Some sense of these would really bring a lot of richness, which already is there, but will improve and could make the message crisp. So that's one question or comment. If you have any response, please go ahead.
Of course, thank you very much for the suggestion. I think this will mainly also improve our robustness checks, where we now had those respective lockdown indicators, and yeah, this will improve the kind of recommendations you also give. Thank you for that. Unless Angela, you have something to add.
I fully agree. I think especially the demand versus supply versus price aspects, I think would be good for our conclusions of our findings. So we'll definitely test that. Thanks.
So one other question I wanted to ask is, because you show intensive and extensive margin effects, it seems to be the case that, like with any shock, we see that more productive firms survive, whereas less productive ones exit. So it seems to be happening that seems to be happening here. I'm not 100% sure how to show that, because you see some firms exit. So if firms is a product, if you're defining it that way, then some reduction in product, whereas intensive margin large increases could be a sign of that, where there is more productive firms getting a bigger market share as less productive ones leave. Now, of course, because there's this GVC angle as well, it also would be interesting how this, if you can just comment on some sort of propagation. One way to do that without demanding too much from both of you is you can look at the previous volumes and how that was, more traded goods survive or less traded goods survive, something like that would be easier to do, reasonable. But yeah, that's another suggestion. But yeah, so if anyone else has question, please go ahead. I'm also posting a survey link in the chat, so please fill in the survey, which helps us improve on our seminar series for all the participants. So I guess if there are not many questions, we can maybe wrap this up, wrap up the session, and I would be happy to talk to both of you afterwards separately as well if you have any comments. One last question or comment would be how easy it is to replicate for other countries in the region this analysis. It would be very nice to look at this if we have so we're looking at Philippines and you have very rich data and analysis, but then it would be interesting what's happening in other countries as well. So if we even have one more country, that would really bring a lot of information to the exercise. So how reasonable is that to do?
Okay.
Yeah. Go ahead, Socrates.
Okay. Yeah, it's I'll say it's easy, especially if you have data. The thing that is there is the event study analysis, or rather one of its advantages is that it requires a lot of high frequency data. So if you have data that is at monthly level, even weekly, daily, it might make more sense, as opposed to if you have annual level, then it becomes difficult. But it's possible. As long as you have the data, then the lockdown indicators, that data that is publicly available, and then you run it. Angela?
Yeah, agreed. We are in the process of replicating this for at least one more country in the region, but not in the same paper, because the paper is already like 60 pages, I think. So I think, discussing the margins and then discussing the different types of lockdowns and the imports and exports was quite a lot. So we are going to replicate and probably in that paper try to do some comparison with what we find in the Philippines, but it's going to be separate so that we don't end up sort of making this paper a comparison paper by just looking at how Philippines was affected. But we'll have the opportunity to do that for the other analysis.
Sounds great. Thank you very much, both of you, for your presentation.
Yeah, thank you for having us. Yeah. Thank you everyone for listening in. I hope the silence means it was clear and not boring. So thank you for joining.
Thank you very much. So we'll end the session formally. Thanks a lot. Yeah, so I believe, I think because it's interesting and there is a lot you both are doing, the three of you, sorry, there's another co-author as well, but yeah, yeah, I would, it would be interesting if there is some discussion of demand versus supply shock in the paper. That would really enrich and drive the message home. I know this is a part of the bigger project, so it's contributing in that aspect, but then you can also speak to these demand versus supply side effects in that. I think that this was a big concern even in the early days of pandemic, whether it's a demand shock or a supply shock, and you are boxing it nicely by looking at external policies rather than all that was going on. So you can, if you bring that, if you look at it through that very simple economics demand supply lens, it would be really interesting for policy as well. So that was my comment. Yeah, but I don't know how easy or hard it would be to just focus on few policies. So if you can replicate your baseline figures just for work closures versus these other types of stringency index, other types of policy, lockdown policies, that would be interesting.
Thanks, and thank you so much for your very comprehensive comments as well. They've gotten the paper to where it is now, so I appreciate that.
Thank you very much for sharing this.
So we are replicating this for Indonesia, obviously. So yeah, so hopefully we'll be able to improve a little bit upon this as well because there's a little bit more data points there.
Sure. Sure, and also I would also like to reiterate, thank you for the comments. Because they made us work very hard. Addressing some of them was not easy. Yeah, but yeah, I think at the end of the day, we are also proud of the end product, the quality of the paper as it looks. Thanks.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure. So, are you in Nairobi, Socrates?
Yes, I am.
Oh, so it must be pretty early for you.
Yeah.
I hope it's a good start to your energizing start to your day.
Unfortunately, it's now coming to 5 a.m. here. But just to be ready for the presentation, I have to go up by 3 a.m. So
thank you very much.
Maybe I'll go back to sleep a bit. Yeah, Angela told me she used to wake up at 3 a.m. sometime. So I said no.
So that's now propagating to her co-authors.
Yeah.
Sounds great. So I guess yeah, I think we can end the session. I don't know if it's going live now or not, but Yeah,
Yeah. Okay, I think we're still alive. Yeah.
maybe we can wave to our fans and then leave.
Thank you for
Yeah,
joining.
bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks. Bye bye.
Shafat, I can end the streaming if you guys want to continue. Oh no, finish.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
All right, bye bye, Shafat.